Welcome to the Loughborough Sportcast, where we seek to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in the world of sport and want to hear from experts from around the world, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Martin Foster, Applied Sport Management Lead at Loughborough University. Today, we're here to talk about classification in Paralympic sport. The host for today's podcast is Nick Diaper, Head of Parasport at Loughborough University and Deputy Chef de Mission for Paralympics GB at Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games. We'll hear Nick discuss the experiences of classification from an athlete's perspective when he talks to a Paracanoe athlete, Paralympic Gold Medalist and 6 times World Champion, Emma Wiggs MBE. He discusses the rules of classification and the negative headlines often associated with classification with current British Paralympics Association classification manager and retired Paralympian, Iain Gowans. And Nick finds out more about the current and future research into classification with Dr. Barry Mason, Senior Research Associate at the Peter Harrison Centre for Disability Sport at Loughborough University.
Hello everyone, my name is Nick Diaper. I'm Head of Parasport at Loughborough University. It's my great pleasure to host what I think is a very exciting podcast today on the subject of classification in Paralympic sport and specifically the importance of evidence-based classification. I'm delighted today that we've been joined by an excellent panel of guests to join me with the conversation. So before we go any further, let's introduce our guests very quickly. Emma, can we come to you first?
My name is Emma Wiggs and I am a Paracanoe athlete. I was a sitting volleyball athlete for the London 2012 Games, but won gold in Rio in Paracanoe, and I'm an 8 times world champion.
Thank you very much, Emma. Iain.
Hi, Nick. Yes, I'm Iain Gowans. I'm the British Paralympic Association's Classification Manager. I've held that role since 2013. I've been in and around Paralympic sport for a number of years now, including being an athlete back in 1996. So last century, I was a swimmer. I competed in Atlanta in 96. Great.
Thanks, Iain. Thanks for joining us. Barry?
Yeah, hi Nick. So my name is Barry Mason. I'm a senior researcher at Loughborough University. So I work for the Peter Harrison Centre for Disability Sport. And I've been involved in para research since about 2007. But then since about 2015 onwards, I've been involved in more classification specific projects.
Excellent. Thank you, Barry. And thank you all for joining us, and particularly to you, Emma, given that I'm sure you're deep in the throes of preparation for your final preparation for Tokyo. So it's great to have athlete representative in such an important topic. So we're going to talk about classification in Paralympic sport and the importance of evidence-based classification. And I guess even for those that are relatively unfamiliar with Paralympic sport, they'll recognize that classification is such a fundamental part of Paralympic sport. You know, it makes it pretty unique in that respect. But I would imagine for most people, it's also a topic that they find either off-putting, complicated, convoluted, mysterious, or all of the above, really. So maybe just to kick us off, I'm really intrigued to hear from each one of you, just when you hear the word classification, what pops into your head? Let's start with you, Emma.
Crikey, Nick. I think it's been such a varied experience. I think horrendous probably comes into my head straight away. But equally, the word essential, it is absolutely crucial and fundamental to everything that we're trying to do as para-athletes, that we have a classification system that is robust and valid. So I think it's probably a bit odd to have 2 such controversial words, but I think from an athlete perspective, I think horrendous and essential.
Interesting choice of words there, Emma. Iain, what about you? What pops in your head when you hear the word classification?
I'd add Emma's essential and unique. You can't have a Paralympic Games or Paralympic sport without classification, but it's something that, like in the British Olympic Association, I don't have a classification counterpart, so it's unique to Paralympic sport. It's very much ours. We own it, and we need it, and we need it to work. We need it to evolve and develop.
And Barry?
Yeah, I think the immediate things that pop into mind are, fair competition, inclusion, participation, those types of things. But I think when you dig a little bit deeper, it's things like stress and anxiety that definitely features, probably from an athlete perspective, more so than anybody.
So that sense of emotion, the emotive response is coming across quite clearly there. And Iain, I think let's come back to you, because I think maybe for those who are less familiar with classification, can you just give us a kind of a very brief summary of what is classification and why is it so important?
Classification is a structure for competition. So it defines who can and who cannot compete in Paralympic sport. And then once it's decided who can compete in Paralympic sport, it separates those athletes out into classes, groups of athletes who compete against each other. So already just from that sentence alone, you can see how impactful it is. So one of the first things classification does is says, yes, Emma can compete in Paracanoe, but other athletes with disabilities, some of them cannot compete in Paracanoe. So again, right off the bat, it's going to be very, very emotive for those athletes who are outside of the sport and outside of Paralympic sport. And then it also shapes who Emma competes against. So again, that's hugely impactful. It determines who are Emma's rivals in our sport.
And Emma, if I can come to you, because you touched on it earlier, like, why is it so important for you from an athlete perspective, the whole classification piece?
I think, Nick, because it is absolutely essential to creating as level a playing field as we can. Whilst also understanding and acknowledging that everyone is coming into parasport with a completely different set of abilities, and therefore it's really challenging. And I think you have to learn to accept that as a para athlete, that these are the confinements of parasport. And therefore, we have to understand that and accept that, and then move on with it. So for me, the classification is always going to have boundaries, and sometimes you're going to fall at the top of that boundary. Sometimes you're going to fall in the middle. Sometimes you're going to fall at the bottom, and that again is a very emotional situation. In Paracanoe, for example, you can have people with no glute function or leg function competing against people with one leg, or two amputations and glute function. So it's a very, very challenging set of circumstances, but it is absolutely essential that the process of classification is therefore, fundamentally driven on evidence and research, and medical diagnosis and things, to allow it to be as fair as possible. But there's still some challenges within that. But absolutely, for me as an athlete, the process I've seen evolve over my time in parasport, in a very, very positive way, to hopefully provide us with the credibility to then go and lay down these performances so that the public understand, and there is that credible recognition of this is like for like competing in as fair as possible situation.
And Barry, if we can come to you from an academic or a research point of view, what are your thoughts kind of initially on classification? Like how do you see classification from an academic standpoint?
Yeah, so from our perspective, we kind of have to just be as impartial as possible with the whole process, because I guess from an academic perspective, we just focused on the evidence-based element of classification. And I guess that's where we're kind of central, really, to helping sports provide that layer of evidence, really, to kind of back up and support their systems. So that's kind of the angle at which we would approach things from.
So we'll come back to that theme in a moment. But Iain, coming back to you, sounds like there's a lot of rules surrounding classification, and I dare say probably a few grey areas. But who's responsible for the governance of classification, just briefly?
That's a good question, Nick. The IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, is the global governing body of the Paralympic movement. So just like the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is the global governing body for Olympic sport, the IPC, which is based in Bonn, is the global governing body for the Paralympic movement. So in 2007, it established a classification code. So prior to that, there wasn't anything across sport that was guiding international federations of what they should and shouldn't do within classification. So the IPC established a code similar in intention to the WADA code to try and standardise, harmonise practices as much as possible. But within that framework, there was still a lot of scope for the classification rules specific to that sport. So when Emma was competing as a volleyball player, the structure for classification in that sport looked different to the sport of new. So like I said, the IPC governs and standardises Paralympic sport, but the sports have their own rules as well. And as an NPC, we're a voting member of the IPC, so it's a very global organisation. The international federations get a vote and vote on the wording of the code, and the nations also get that vote as well.
Thanks, Iain. Emma, let's come to you, because I think lots of people listening will be intrigued to know what, from an athlete perspective, what's it like to actually be classified? And Iain, obviously you mentioned your own athletic career, so it'd be fascinating just to hear from two athlete perspectives as to what it is actually like to undergo the process of classification. But let's start with Emma.
And I think, Nick, it's really important to recognise that every athlete deals with it differently. I have always found the process of classification incredibly stressful and emotional. And I think it's because when you have a disability, you spend a lot of your time and your energy and your life trying to show what you can do despite your disability. And classification is the complete opposite of that. It is really them highlighting what you can't do. And I have always found that an incredibly emotional process to go through. And then if you think about the fact that when you go through these classifications, you are at an international competition. So you're at the point that you've been preparing for all year, and then you're having to go through a very necessary and absolutely essential, but very, very stressful and emotional day, normally, or part of a day, in order to get through that process. So it's a really tricky one, because I don't think necessarily it needs to be as stressful and as emotional as it is, but I think it is always going to have that element, because it is actually highlighting things that you can't do. And therefore that's what puts you in this category or in this category. So I think maybe some people deal with it really well. I think I often found it incredibly stressful. So to be able to now know that we've got a really robust, really evidence-based system in place, it means that we don't have to go through it all the time, because we've been through it and provided the information to get that confirmed status. So it's a pressure off, but equally it's an evolving system. But certainly I've seen it progress hugely, and I've seen the classifiers' understanding of what it's like to go through it improve. So maybe at the start, when because I used to cry every time, and I couldn't help it. It was just this emotional response, and you could see the look of shock on their faces. And as they're picking up your legs and letting them drop to the table, you could see how shocked they were that you were crying. And I used to then eventually go in and say, right, look, I'm going to cry, just ignore it, let's crack on and get it done. And I saw that their understanding evolve as the system has evolved. And I think now it is certainly in Paracanoe, it's in a much better place, where I think it probably is less stressful for the actual athletes involved, because there's a greater understanding of actually how that process can impact you from a mental health perspective as well.
And obviously Paracanoe, a relatively new addition to the Paralympic program, Rio 2016, the first time it was included. So I guess we should expect the classification system to be evolving as we go. But just tell us a bit more, Emma, what the actual process involves from a Paracanoe perspective.
Yeah, you're right, Nick. We are a newish sport, but I actually believe, from my experience, certainly we've got one of the most robust classification systems that there is out there. We've done a huge amount of evidence-based research to try and produce this system. So we have a medical classification, and we have a technical on water classification, and normally one follows the other, and it is it's quite a lengthy process. It's probably an hour on the medical and an hour or half an hour on the water, and then they also look at it in race. So people have to do certain situations and certain skills and perform things at speed, and they're videoed and watched by classifiers on the water, and then they also video and watch you in a race situation. So that then gives them an idea of how you're performing, in your test compared to how you're performing in a competition. So it's got lots of, from my point of view, it's got lots of fail safes in there to be able to highlight if maybe they've got something wrong. And I've seen that evolve over the years. I've lost 2 European gold medals to classification hiccups, shall we say, and the classifiers have then held their hands up and say, look, we've got this wrong, we need to tweak this, this and this. And that's what you go through when you're evolving as a new sport. But certainly the process now with the medical and the technical, and that's done at a national level and an international level, I think gives it the credibility and consistency, I think, that it deserves.
And Iain, just before we bring Barry back in, if you can remember back to your competition days, what did you have a similar experience to Emma in terms of just how emotional the process was, or what were your experiences?
Yeah, no, I would definitely recognise myself what Emma went through. I've got cerebral palsy, so my impairment's from birth, and I've got quite high muscle tone, so I've got lots of spasm and tension on one side of my body. And as a consequence of that, I was in and out of medical facilities and hospitals fairly regularly as a child. So I was very used to being pulled and prodded by physios. But the classification that I experienced back in '94 is still quite distinct to my memory, because it was the only time on a physio bench I was asked repeatedly to flex my right foot. And I was trying really hard to flex my right foot and it wouldn't move at all. I knew I couldn't move it, but I hadn't really interrogated that or thought about it. Nobody had ever asked me repeatedly to do it. Yeah, so Emma's right. You have to, in classification, really capture and focus on what the athlete will never be able to do. And that's very counterintuitive, because everything else in Paralympic sport is get these athletes to go as fast, as hard, as effective in the sport as they can. But for that moment of classification, you'll have to measure and capture and write down and confirm with the athlete what they will never be able to do. So it is a hugely emotional experience for the athlete to go through.
Well, thanks to both of you for being kind of so open and honest on that. I think it might come as a surprise to many people, just how emotive that experience is for athletes. So we do appreciate your candidness. So Barry, we've heard evidence-based classification mentioned multiple times already, just in the brief chat we've had. What is evidence-based classification, and why do we need it?
Yeah, so evidence-based classification simply means that sports classification systems and how they allocate athletes into specific classes, it needs to be underpinned by some form of empirical evidence so that it's effectively meeting its stated purpose. And the stated purpose of classification is to effectively make sure that we're minimising the impact of impairment on the outcomes of performance. So it's that layer of evidence really that's required to underpin systems, and that's effectively where research starts to enter into the fray. You need it simply because certain systems might be reliant too much on subjective information, and when that's the case, some individual athletes might end up becoming disadvantaged compared to others. And when it's also subjective, you do leave yourself open to having your classification contested, and that obviously brings with it a lot of problems at international competitions. So it's just there to kind of objectify the whole process, really.
And Iain, from an NPC perspective or from a governance perspective, why do you feel evidence-based classification is so important?
It was Barry quite succinctly put it there. Yeah, the purpose of classification is to minimise the impact of impairment on the outcome of competition. So we need to have a really good understanding of how impairment affects competition. And we are just on the start of this journey, to be honest, in terms of having the evidence in place. Probably the best example where you see this is in vision impaired sports. So there's classes within vision impaired sports. There is a minimum impairment criteria that is in vision impaired sports. The classes are progressive, so B3, you're mildly affected. B2, you're much more affected, and B1, you're essentially, you can't say anything at all. But it's not designed to be used on the field of play as such. It's just B3 is not as bad as B1. So you could be a downhill skier following your guide down a ski slope, or you could be a 100-metre runner running in a straight line, but you're both B3. So that doesn't take into account light conditions, running around bends, snow, whether you use your both eyes at the same time, whether you shut one eye. So in 2013, recognising this issue within Paralympic sport, the IPC established some research centres to harness and drive classification research forward. So Emma's sport of Paracanoe has really benefited from that sort of work as a new sport, as you've already pointed out. Taekwondo as well has quite a lot of published research, as has badminton as well. So the newer sports within Paralympic sport have a lot of published research around them. Intellectual impairment also has a lot of published research around them. If you have a quick Google of Paralympic scandals, then the intellectual impairment scandal of 2000 is always top of the list. They found a Spanish basketball team at the Sydney Games had been falsifying their paperwork and getting through the system. So for that reason, the intellectual impairment was removed as an eligible impairment within Paralympic sport, and they spent the following 8 to 9 years researching how to make classification specific to intellectual impairment. How do you prove they've got an impairment in the first place, and how does that impairment actually affect them in the field of play? So it's not enough just to say yes, this athlete has an IQ of below a certain amount. It has to be, and this affects them in this way, which is why when you see intellectual impairment in athletics, there's no 100-metre runners. It's all distance events, because pacing is a critical part of intellectual impairment, and it's all technical events such as long jump as well. So like I said, we're just at the start of this journey, and it's a journey without end as well. We'll always be tinkering and improving with classification. I always say and compare classification rules to not dissimilar to rugby rules. Every time you watch the Six Nations, there's always a slight tweak from the last year, whether to make it safer for the players or make it better to watch or easier to understand. So this journey that we're on in terms of evidence-based classification may never end. So Barry's in a very good line of work.
And Iain, you mentioned yourself kind of the term scandal when it comes to classification, and I guess for anyone who does follow Paralympic sport, and even for those who are kind of casual observers, there's been some very negative headlines when it comes to classification in the international media over the last 4 to 6 years. Do you feel that evidence-based classification will kind of take us into a place where those headlines are less kind of negative or sensationalized? Because maybe one of the issues at the moment is the lack of evidence-based classification does mean it's subject to all sorts of negative press.
That'd be one element of it. Yeah, I think if we could stand over why the minimum impairment criteria for a certain sport is where it is with published research that's been peer reviewed, then that's definitely an easier argument to have than just it's always been like this or this is what we think it is. However, for me, there's certain things that get picked up on classification that evidence-based on its own will not be able to address, no matter how scientific the system is and how evidence-based it is. You will always have a range of impairments in each class. So when you first come to Paralympic sport, you will see athletes competing against each other who all look slightly different, who all have slightly different levels of impairment, and that initially can be quite difficult to get your head around. And it's, as we've said all along, it's hugely emotive. So that emotive nature of classification will not go away with evidence-based. And it's also very easy for people when they see an athlete win by a large distance that they're benefiting from the classification system, rather than think that athlete is just a really, really good athlete and is just naturally much better than the other athletes that they're competing against. Yeah, so we definitely need more evidence-based classification system, but the education around classification, both within Paralympic sport and to the general public, needs to improve as well, so we have less controversy. Having said that, though, it's a bit like anti-doping. Like, there's brilliant work that goes on in anti-doping around the world, whether that's the actual WADA code itself. I think it's broken records in terms of how many governments have actually signed up to it. There's loads of groundbreaking research in anti-doping. There's loads of brilliant education in anti-doping, but you only ever hear it in mainstream press when somebody does a rule violation or test positive or countries get banned. So it's just one of those things that it will only hit the press when it goes wrong. You won't hear about the hundreds of athletes that go through it and it works fine for them.
And Emma, how, from an athlete perspective, and as an athlete looking to defend her Paralympic title in Tokyo, how does it make you feel when you see some of those kind of negative headlines around classification in the media?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, Nick, and I think it's a really interesting point that Iain made around the anti-doping, because I was actually going to say the same sort of thing. I think we with classification are probably where anti-doping was, maybe 5-6 years ago, and I think it is, some people are always going to find a way of pushing the system and cheating, and it is a real shame that those are the ones that make the headlines. I think for me, I feel really confident, particularly within my sport. I've seen the work that's gone on. I've seen the development from the early days into kind of 2013 through to now to give me the confidence that we have got a robust system. I think it will improve when we get more athletes, because I think when you've got a small number of athletes, you have to have big classes to give you the field. So therefore you are, for example, in one of the classes, it's quite a wide class. I think there's 6 or 7 points between people. Now that's a huge range of disabilities. So when we get more people involved in parasport, we will then be able to have this better, robust classification system, which will then split people into more equal classes in terms of their ability to compete and deliver. But absolutely, I agree with Iain. You can't just look at face value and think, well, that person's won by 2.5 seconds, therefore they must be in the wrong class. You've got to look at the athlete themselves and the work that they're doing, because we spend every single day of our lives trying to make the bits of us that work better. And therefore, particularly in Great Britain, we've got the world's leading Paracanoe team. We are pushing boundaries all the time. We are setting new world records in every class all the time, and that is because of the training and stuff that goes into maximising what we've got to be able to deliver in those events. So, I feel proud really that I'm in a sport that has been able to develop that process. But equally, I'm proud of the fact that irrespective of where I fall in my class, which is near the bottom in one of them and near the top in the other, that's just the way it works, I'm still able to compete and deliver against, so-called more able athletes. So I think it should hopefully give all athletes confidence that it's what you do with what you've got that makes the difference, not necessarily write yourself off because you might fall lower in the class.
So it's becoming very clear that, evidence-based classification is kind of critical to the credibility of the Paralympic kind of movement going forward. And Barry, no pressure on you or kind of the academic elements of research, but it feels like there's some key opportunities here and a key, I guess, responsibility or certainly role that research can play in moving us towards a better position. So could you just tell us a bit more about what type of evidence-based classification is currently taking place at Loughborough?
Yeah, so currently we're only really involved at the moment with a project with the IWBF. So I'm sure you're probably aware of all what's been going on in wheelchair basketball, with them temporarily, I think, being removed from the Paris 2024 games. So the IPC kind of dictated to them that they need to come up with and establish some minimum impairment criteria. So that's a project that we've got going on at the moment with the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation to try and help that sport establish some minimum impairment criteria, hopefully so that they can be reinstated for Paris 2024. That's kind of the aim and objective of that one. Other than that, historically, we have been involved, I guess, with the Paravar, some of the Paravar, the early work that went into Paravar back in 2015, which was an interesting one because that was all quite last minute, really. I think, if I remember rightly, and Emma will be able to correct me if this isn't right, I think Parakayak was on the programme for Rio 2016, but I think the ICF and this Swedish research group that we were working with were really trying to make sure that Paravar could also be part of the programme. So they were looking to quickly collect some data and information to see if we could create a system for Paravar to then be considered eligible by the IPC. Unfortunately, that was a little bit too much to ask with those timelines, so that one wasn't actually possible. But then, yeah, since then at the PHC, we've been probably most heavily involved in classification research with the sport of wheelchair rugby. That's something that's been kind of ongoing throughout the last maybe 4 or 5 years.
And Emma, because you were presumably one of the participants or one of the individuals who was part of the research for the Paracanoe stuff, do you want to just give us a feel for kind of what involvement you had as an athlete?
Yeah, and I think, I'm eternally grateful to Barry and the team of at Loughborough who managed to get the research done and added such value to this process, because I was actually one of the athletes that was in a kayak originally for Rio, then they changed it to VAR, and then the VAR got scrapped and put back to the kayak. So it was a real, up and down process. But I'm also one of the athletes that will be hopefully benefiting in just under 150 days' time in Tokyo, where the VAR and the kayak will both be eligible boats. So we were very fortunate as a GB squad. We were given the opportunity to work with Loughborough and to work with the international classifiers and to go to Sweden to do some testing. And we really bought into that because we could see the value to try and provide this evidence for them then to completely rejig the classification process. And as a result of the efforts of I think the GB squad and UK Sport and Loughborough in getting that research to happen, it created a new system and actually a more level playing field, and certainly a more credible one, to which they could go to the IPC and get this VAR included into the Paralympic Games, which is actually a monumental achievement in a time where potentially elite sport is facing some real struggles to try and maintain its position. So I think I feel incredibly fortunate and lucky to have been part of that. And it was an interesting process too. I'm a bit of a geek and I quite like the research side of things. So to go and to be able to be part of something with such a biomechanical type analysis was really interesting to me, and also gave me as an athlete some real belief that this classification system that they were going to develop was going to be fundamentally fairer and more accurate, and ultimately that's what anyone who takes part in parasport wants.
And Barry, can we come back to you, just a bit more insight into the wheelchair basketball work? Like who's involved in that project, and what's the actual essence of, what does the actual research itself entail?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. So it obviously came through the IPC to the IWBF, stipulating what they needed to do, and that was to create minimum impairment criteria. The IWBF then reached out to us at Loughborough because we've obviously been involved with a few other international federations trying to help them work towards evidence-based classification. So they reached out to us to try and kind of lead the process that was needed for them. And it was a tricky one because the minimum impairment criteria is usually the step that's developed towards the end. So there's like 5-step process usually for research in classification, and minimum impairment criteria is usually the last one in an ideal world, but they obviously were under pressure to create this sooner rather than later. So what we've had to do is we've had to adopt what's known as a Delphi study. So you're looking to just gain expert consensus from individuals in and around the sport about what they think their minimum impairment criteria should look like for athletes to be eligible to participate in the sport. Obviously, you would rather do that by collecting some kind of objective scientific data, but with the timeline that they were under, expert consensus is kind of seen as an acceptable alternative. So we're kind of still in the middle of the process of that at the moment, and it will start to unfold later on in the year, hopefully.
And in your experience, Barry, what have you found as some of the challenges of doing research in this field?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few. So I think Iain's already touched on maybe one or two of them. I think time is a big challenge. To do everything properly, it's a very time consuming process from start to finish, if there even is a finish. I would say cost as well, because it's research. All research requires funding. There's not a huge number of avenues out there for funding in kind of Paralympic classification, so to speak. We've been fortunate once, maybe with a small grant from the IPC, but the IPC can't fund projects in all Paralympic sports. It's a bit of a challenge as well for some of the international federations to really support it to some extent. So being able to acquire funds to do the research is a big one. And then sample size. That was the downfall really with the Paravar project in the first instance, was trying to get enough people to prove that your evidence is robust effectively, and that the IPC are satisfied with. From my experience, it's always been quite easy within the UK. GB athletes are always very, very proactive with engaging in classification-based research, but it can be a challenge sometimes to engage international athletes. It's okay if you've got the backing and the support of the International Federation, who are actively trying to promote the research, which we've been fortunate enough with on this wheelchair basketball project and as well on some of the wheelchair rugby projects. But when you haven't had that kind of push from the International Federation, it's a real challenge to get athletes to engage with the process sometimes.
Barry, on that, do you think, I'm trying to find solutions in this, so the obvious thing would be at an international competition, athletes are asked to take part in the research when they're there. But as an athlete sitting here, I'm thinking, are you kidding me? That's the last thing I want to do as I'm preparing for a World Championships or a European Championships. But I wonder whether there's anything that could be done to attach it to an international competition that would not affect the competition, but equally give you guys the research, because that is your prime time, isn't it? Because it's, or even the games, but then obviously not this year. But it's, I don't know. I just think there must be a better solution than trying to find countries that can suddenly pop to Sweden for a weekend. Or
yeah, definitely, that's not an ideal scenario at all, is it? I think, and doing it at the competitions as well, it's not ideal, because the last thing researchers want to do is trying to almost interfere with athletes when they're in that preparation phase for some huge competitions. It's almost trying to strike the balance though between the opportunity alongside the cost, because at competitions you obviously always have lots of athletes from lots of different nations all in one place at the same time, so that kind of reduces the cost. Whereas if we were to try and collect data from athletes at training camps and things like that, it's more travel involved, more convenient for the athletes probably. So I don't know the solution. There could well be something in the future where we go towards classification centres where athletes maybe have to come into perhaps a university for classification specific purposes. Maybe that might work slightly better.
Some really interesting insights there from you, Barry, and a great question from Emma there, because I guess for many people who've been involved with research that involves athletes themselves, there's always some challenges that throws up, and I think worth us noting that some of the other research that Loughborough is undertaking around evidence-based classification within visually impaired sports, and specifically around in the sport of goalball. Iain, I know you've been kind of involved in some of the early stages of that, or certainly helping to facilitate that research in the first place. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that and where you hope that project will go?
Yeah, similar to what I said earlier about the current status of vision impairment classification for athletes with a vision impairment. Goalball is in a similar position to all those other sports that I mentioned, but they've got a B1, B2, B3 eligibility criteria. All athletes compete as long as they've got at least a B3 classification against each other, and they wear eye masks to establish a level of lack of sight that's the same for everyone on court. However, like I've said, though, that doesn't really take into account different people's vision. It doesn't really make sure that there is athletes with a more severe impairment coming into the sport. So hopefully with a very long-term project, we'll be able to establish a minimum impairment criteria that's relevant to the sport of goalball, which is a sport that's exclusively for athletes with a vision impairment, and something that's a bit more relevant to them on the field of play.
And just staying with you for a while longer, Iain, I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, IPC announced a 3-year review process of the classification code. You just tell us a little bit about what that actually means, and what role do you feel evidence-based classification will play in the review of the code?
Yes, we're talking now, it's the end of March 21, and as you say, recently the IPC announced the code review process and the code review drafting team for its athlete classification code. Like I said earlier, the first code came out in 2007. That was then consulted on and published a revised code in 2015. But the IPC now feels that there's been enough evolution within Paralympic sport to go and do that again. And like I said, classification needs to keep evolving anyway. So I would imagine that in 10 years' time, we'll be looking at this at the very least, again, in terms of a process. So the IPC have assembled a multi-discipline, multi-nation team to support the drafting process. There will be 3 rounds of consultation where they will ask for submissions, both from inside the Paralympic movement, so national Paralympic committees like ourselves, but also international federations, international disability sport organisations. But anybody with interest in Paralympic sport can submit thoughts on the code itself and what needs to be in the code. They will also publish during those 3 rounds of consultation draft versions of the codes and international standards. And again, the Paralympic movement and any organisation or individual interested in the Paralympic movement can make submissions on that. So we're looking for to get the IPC's General Assembly to sign off on a new code just before the Paris Games in 2024. However, it won't kick in until after the Paris Games for the start of the Los Angeles cycle in 2028.
So some interesting times ahead, no doubt, for classification, especially when codes are being reviewed, and no doubt an interesting journey to go on. I guess to bring us to a close, I'd be fascinated just to get each of your views on where you see things going in the future of evidence-based classification in particular, or what you'd like to see. Emma, I wonder if we can come to you first on that particular perspective, from an athlete perspective. Like, where do you think things will go, and what would you like to see?
Yeah, I think it's going in a hugely positive way, Nick. I think we're moving into a future where hopefully it will be evidence-based, it will have research to back it up, like the boys have already said. I think for me, from an athlete perspective, I would like to think that athletes that have been through the process and are currently in the process could share those experiences with other athletes. I think it's really, really important for athletes that have had positive experiences, because despite the fact I might find it emotional and challenging and cry, I have found it positive as well, because I've got through it, and sport has given me so much, and I have to just accept that classification is a necessary part of that. And I think I'd love to see athletes sharing their experiences, sharing their thoughts, and sharing their feedback in an open way. I think it's similar, like Iain said, to anti-doping. There's sometimes a reluctance to talk about it and share it, because it is that slightly emotive topic. And I would like to think that current athletes could do that and share that with younger athletes. And also, I think athletes that have retired, I feel like sport has given us so much, and so when retirement comes and knocks on the door, I feel like, what could we give back? Well, we must be able to give back something in terms of classification research or feedback or positivity or something, and I think that would be something really useful to pursue as well.
There's some very interesting thoughts there, Emma. I mean, I really like your idea around how athletes can contribute to research in this in the future. And even just listening to both yours and Iain's experiences of that emotive element of it is perhaps something that really hasn't been captured from an academic viewpoint, and actually how the athlete experience itself can be made better, so that we don't have people crying in the classification process. And thank you for not crying on us so far. I'm conscious we're not done yet, though.
No, but I think also, Nick, you're so right. I think there's other elements to understand, but equally, if we can't share those experiences within our own sports, then no one's going to be sharing them wider than that, are they? So I think we need to be better as athletes to share it with others that are going through it, and say, look, okay, it's okay if you feel like this. You might feel like this. This is what it looks like. This is what's going to happen, etc., and be really collaborative on that approach, and recognise that it's okay to feel about it in different ways. But absolutely, I think less emotion and more positivity would be great.
Yeah, sure. Barry, what about you? Where would you like to see things go, or where do you think they will go from a research point of view?
I think from a research point of view, it's quite difficult to try and predict where things might go. I think it's fairly clearly mapped out from a research perspective where we still need to go before we can kind of predict where we might need to take it in the future. This 3-year review period, it actually gives us a nice bit of time to really just keep adding evidence behind tests of impairment for sports, how we quantify and how we measure their performance. So regardless of what comes out of the 3-year review process, it's valuable time really to kind of add a lot more evidence to the sports. I think one of the biggest challenges moving forward from a research perspective will probably be to establish more around intentional misrepresentation and how we can actually identify that. There's little bits of research starting to emerge on that, but I think that's going to be a big area for research in the future to really try and identify what that looks like.
And Iain, I guess maybe the last word over to you from the perspective of a National Paralympic Committee. Where do you see the future going?
We definitely need evidence-based research to continue. We also need it to be implemented in some sports. There's been quite a lot of good research done, but the international federations have yet to put them into actual rule changes. I'm keeping an eye out for judo. The International Federation for judo is going to be amongst the first long-standing Paralympic sports to implement a new system based on research, and that's always quite a choppy thing to navigate for athletes, because as soon as you move that minimum impairment criteria, if it goes too high, then people towards the bottom of that class feel excluded. But if you move it down, then you're potentially kicking athletes out of the sport that have been in the sport for a while. So I would expect that to continue throughout the Paris and LA cycles as IFs implement the evidence-based research. And when you implement that sort of work, you will have consequences that you did expect, but also consequences that you didn't expect. So again, we'll be coming back to the likes of to Barry and his colleagues to do the research again as our understanding of the impact of the impairment on the outcome of competition continues to evolve and improve. And from an athlete's perspective of classification, I think the whole education piece around classification needs to evolve more. As an NPC, the British Paralympic Association have stepped up our education post-Rio. We've got some nice tools. We've got a very nice 3-minute video that explains everything very succinctly on our website and our YouTube channel. And we've got some other good initiatives in the education space, but that needs to bed in. It needs to win hearts and minds of people with long-standing negative opinions and experiences of classification, and we need the wider Paralympic movement around the world to also adopt and drive ahead with athlete education. But I like a lot Emma's chat about using experienced athletes to nurture and bring through the less experienced athletes as well, and get everyone talking about classification in a positive, constructive fashion, even though it's a bit emotional to go through. I liken it to, as well as a doping control test, it's a bit like a job interview or going to the dentist or even going through security at an airport. It's something that's essential that you have to do, but it doesn't mean to say you're going to enjoy it.
Well, Iain, Barry, Emma, massive thank you to the three of you for your insights and sharing your expertise. That's been a fascinating, albeit brief, journey through classification and exploring, the rationale for evidence-based classification and why it's important. Emma, very best of wishes and good luck for your final preparation for Tokyo. We'll be with you all the way, and it's certainly been a real pleasure for me to host this and to kind of get your perspectives of what classification means to the three of you, I guess, as key stakeholders in the process. So the athlete voice and the athlete perspective, which is paramount to the whole thing. The NPC perspective in terms of the governance and ensuring things move forward and develop, and then Barry from a research point of view, and to hear all the good work that Loughborough is doing, particularly in this space of classification. So many thanks to the three of you for your time. It's been a really enjoyable process listening to you guys, and certainly I hope everyone has taken something away from that.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
Cheers, Nick.
Thanks for listening to the Loughborough Sportcast. If you want to get in touch and let us know any subject areas or experts that you'd be keen to listen to, then contact me, Martin Foster, on m.foster@alborough.ac.uk or tweet me at martinfoster82. Bye for now. We'll see you next time.